Okay, Mr. Otway here, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the impact of the Great Depression and then what Hoover actually did about it. If you're using this to learn from, then the best thing to do is listen and pause and write things down. If it's got to the point just before the exams and you're using it to revise from, best thing to do is write down everything you think you know already about the impact of the Depression and Hoover's reaction in one colour, and then listen to this and pause as you go through whenever you come across something you didn't remember and write it in a different colour, and you'll see what you have to do to revise. So without further ado, the impact of the Depression. As a result of the Depression, unemployment reached the staggering levels of 16 million people without a job. The Depression affected all areas of US society: rural, urban, men, women, white, black, it didn't matter who you were, the Depression affected practically everybody. However, it affected some people in more ways than others, or in worse ways than others. For example, African Americans, who we know are a group of people, the history of whom we have to look at very closely on this course. Well, during the Depression they were 4 to 6 times more likely to be unemployed than white people. Women were also more likely to be laid off than men, because at the time people were sexist and they thought men were superior to women. There are no official figures, but estimates suggest that unemployment went from about 3.2% of all of the people in the United States in 1929, so not that many people, well, a fairly big chunk of people actually, but in terms of percentages it's nothing compared to the numbers of people in 1933. If you think of the millions of people in America, 3.2% represents a fair chunk in 1929, but in 1933 that had gone up to 25.2% of the population without a job. That's 1 in 4, a quarter of everybody. Think of a quarter of everybody that you know and imagine they didn't have a job. Think of all the money they wouldn't be spending and how that would have an impact on the economy and make it so difficult for the spending and the credit and everything to return and the recovery to happen. But I'm not stopping there. The amount that the US economy grew in 1929 was 6.7%, but the figure in 1932 is estimated to be minus 14.7%. In other words, the economy shrunk, and not just a little bit. If I can put this into context for you, Britain had something that you might remember from the news being called a credit crunch, which was our own, fairly recent in our history, economic slowdown, which kind of started in 2007. In 2009, it's estimated that our economy shrunk by 2.9%. So compared to the Great Depression in America, where it shrunk by in 1932, minus 14.7, and it only shrunk minus 2.9 in our country in 2009. You can see how the Great Depression was just colossal. And if we've got specifics, in 1932, we look at the coal industry. Coal production fell to its lowest levels since 1904. There was less demand, there were less businesses using coal, there were less people who could afford coal to heat their homes. So, because people weren't buying the coal production stopped or slowed down significantly to the lowest level since 1904. And there is an estimated 300,000 people lost their jobs in the coal industry. And of course they couldn't spend any money, so other companies missed out on the money they would have been spending before, and they laid off workers and the whole thing went in a big spiral. Furthermore, steel and iron production fell by 59%. And again, hundreds of thousands of people, though I don't have an exact figure for this one, would have lost their jobs as a result of that. And it was a spiral. I always think of it as a spiral. Factory closes down, people lose jobs. The people lose the jobs if the factory closed down, stop spending. And so they don't spend as much money in the rest of the economy, and this has a knock-on effect on another factory or a business, and they shut down, and they stop spending. And the cycle just continues, and it's so difficult to get out of it. By 1933, it was said that 1/3 of the workforce in the industrial cities were out of work. And people were struggling to find homes. You know, there were said to have been, by 1932, 2 million homeless people. 2 million people without a home. I mean, that's just crazy. And these people didn't just stick around in doorways. They tried to build their own homes, on the edges of cities usually, in spaces. You might have heard of the famous Central Park in New York. That even had a place where people were trying to build their own homes. And those homes that they were trying to build, the little towns that sprung up, were referred to as HOOVERVILLES, after the president, who they blamed for what happened to them. Some people didn't stay in one place and build a Hooverville, but drifted around the country, trying to look for work, going from one place to the next, and maybe finding the odd bit here and there before having to move on because the person who'd employed them for that temporary job could no longer afford to employ them. Those people drifting around the place trying to find work, well, they were known as hobos, and that's where that word comes from. It's not just in the industrial centres as well. Farmers went bankrupt. Sometimes food was just left to rot. And there was a drought in 1931 which made things even worse. Prices plummeted. Poor farming methods as well had exhausted the soil. So you might remember from the First World War, farmers were trying to produce as much as they could because they could always sell it abroad. They'd borrowed money to be able to do that, to buy more land and to invest in fertilisers and machinery. And in the 20s, as Europe recovered and tariffs were put on foreign goods and therefore on American goods in foreign countries, it meant that farmers struggled to sell abroad and their market had shrunk. Farmers were struggling, and they struggled even more in the 30s because these poor farming methods to try to get as much as they could out of the soil exhausted the soil. And that, if it's not got nutrients in it, soil doesn't stick together so much. And when there's a drought, that makes that even worse. Soil becomes dusty. And there was also high winds in lots of the, huge expanses of America where there's no trees to break up the wind. And what we got there was a dust bowl, massive dust storms where the soil was literally blown away in some cases. And if you look on the internet, you might see loads of pictures of abandoned farms from this period that are still abandoned to this day and just left because there was nothing to grow on. The soil had been blown away. And where did the farmers go that left these places? Well, the worst hit states were Oklahoma, Colorado, New Mexico, Kansas as well. And what many of them did, not all of them, but many of them, travelled west to the fruit-picking regions of the west coast. And there they were met with scorn because, of course, they were coming and seen as taking people's jobs from the current area. And they had nicknames. So if they were from Oklahoma, they were known as Okies. If they were from Arkansas, they were called Arkies. And even if they weren't actually from those places, sometimes I'm aware that they were given those nicknames. Like somebody from out of town, it's an Okie. Even if they weren't actually from Oklahoma. It was a bit of a negative name to call people. So think of those ridiculously huge effects. And if you can name some of those impacts of the Depression, well, that would be fantastic for your exam. And what did Hoover do all about this? Well, perhaps the greatest disaster ever to hit the United States was taking hold. Absolute turmoil was going on everywhere. Millions of people were struggling, losing homes, losing jobs, struggling to find something to eat. What was Hoover doing? Well, some people might say nothing. And those people would be wrong. Because Hoover certainly didn't do nothing. He did some things. It's easy to argue that he could have done more, and also it's possible to argue that the actions he did choose were misguided. And it's also a fact that in the 1932 presidential election, he lost by an absolute landslide. I've already mentioned that the shanty-towns that were growing up on the edges of cities were being called Hoovervilles. Well, we know that Hoover and the Republicans of the 20s believed strongly in laissez-faire and rugged individualism, and Hoover was no exception to that. He'd believed it since an early age. He thought the best way to help people out is to encourage them to help themselves. He didn't want them to be reliant on the government because they thought they'd end up completely relying on the government and being less self-sufficient, and it wouldn't really help them in the long run. And you might remember he'd seen this when he helped in Mississippi, when Coolidge put him in charge. He asked for volunteers, he got a lot of volunteers and a lot of money, especially from people like Rockefeller, the Rockefeller Fund, and that helped people out in Mississippi, and he got a lot of praise for it, and it's one of the reasons why he became president. But he stuck to those beliefs rigidly. And actually, if the economy's going well, maybe rich people are willing to lend a hand in a disaster. But when things are going badly, when the economy's in a depression, what he found was people were quite reluctant to lend money willingly. But what did he attempt to do? Well, let's break that down. First, there's the Agricultural Marketing Act of 1930, which was an act which allowed the government to lend some money to farmers at generous rates, and to be able to lend more than they could have afforded from the banks. But what this fails to take into account, it's a nice idea, is that the farmers didn't need to borrow money. This was, if you remember, how they got in trouble in the first place in the 1920s as a result of them borrowing during the First World War. What the farmers needed was not to borrow money, it was the stabilisation of prices. They wanted the prices to stay high, and they kept dropping. Or, of course, they might have wanted the ability to be able to sell their produce abroad, but they couldn't because of the tariffs, which not only continued, but actually got higher. One of Hoover's reactions to the whole issue of the Great Depression was to increase tariffs to try to protect American goods. But as we know, what happens if you raise a tariff is foreign countries, they raise tariffs on American goods in response, which is absolutely no good for farmers. And the most famous tariff, which is the example of him increasing tariffs, was the Hawley-SMOOT Tariff Act of 1930. But that's not the only thing he did to try to help farmers. Misguided or not, he set up the Grain Stabilisation Corporation, which tried to keep prices from dropping any further by buying wheat so that it could be stored until prices went back up. But of course, this was an artificial thing. If you're remembering things we've learnt about before, Coolidge had denied or vetoed an idea to do something similar for farmers. Well, by this point, Hoover was maybe getting a bit more desperate and willing to try things, so he did try to set up something where the government would buy wheat from farmers. But the problem was, farmers started to realise they could just produce as much wheat as they wanted, and the government would always be there to buy it. So they just kept producing more and more, which meant prices continued to drop because supply was outweighing demand. So maybe a nice idea, Agricultural Marketing Act, lending money, and Grain Stabilisation Corporation buying up surplus wheat, but in reality didn't actually help things. What about industry? Well, he believed, as we've said, about involuntary action. He wanted people who had money to lend to people who didn't, but humans are quite greedy and don't often lend things willingly. When was the last time, if you think, that you just gave something away? It doesn't happen very often. And he met with businessmen and asked them not to cut the workforce or wages. Please don't do that. He tried to explain to them why it was important they didn't do that because the people needed to have money to spend, and it keeps going around the economy. And businessmen, I imagine, went, "Oh yes, Mr. President, oh yes, we'll do that." But actually, they had no reason to do it. They weren't tied to do it, and businessmen tended to do what they wanted. He also asked state governments to spend some money on public works to try to get people in employment. Whether they did that or not was entirely up to them. In 1932, which is a significant year because this is when a lot of the things he tried to do happened, when he actually started to give significant money. Election year, anybody? Well, in 1932 he gave $500 million to try to help agencies provide relief, which is, to try to provide people with food who were struggling, that sort of thing. It's not going to solve anything. That's like putting a plaster over a cut. There's the Emergency Relief Act in July of 1932. And what he tried to do with that was give $300 million to state governments to try to help the unemployed, to come up with schemes to help the unemployed, to get them in employment. Again, 1932, maybe he's doing it because of his election thing. There's the RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. It was the most radical measure that Hoover introduced to deal with the Depression. And it was a little bit like some of the things we're going to see with the Roosevelt's New Deal policies. It lent up to $2 billion, a huge amount, $2 billion to rescue banks, insurance companies, railroads and construction companies. He was trying to prop up companies to stop them going bust, because of course if they go bust they can't employ people, and that just makes the whole situation worse. So that may be the most radical thing that he did. And then there's the Home Loan Bank Act of 1932. So another example of Hoover trying to do something. He tried to set up a fund to stimulate house building and home ownership, but at the same time people were struggling to pay their home loans and ended up homeless. So 12 regional banks were set up around the country with a fund of $12 million to lend to people who were struggling to pay their home loans. Those banks had 41,000 applicants to this fund, and 3 were accepted. That's right, 41,000 applicants, 3 were accepted, which again says he didn't do enough to force people to do this sort of thing. And there's another example, so that was with individuals, but with businesses. He set up something called the National Credit Corporation, the NCC, which was in 1931. And what it did is he got together a group of healthy banks with plenty of money and got them to agree to prop up and lend money to less healthy banks. And you can imagine the bank managers going, yes, I think it's a wonderful idea, yes, we'll lend money to the smaller banks. And then when Hoover walks out the room going, I'm not going to do that. So what they had committed to, in words only, was to lend a pot together that they got to all these healthy banks of $500 million, so that they could prop up these less healthy banks, these banks that were struggling, maybe a bit smaller. Of the $500 million, they lent $10 million. So there you go again. And the problem, as we see over and over again here, is that Hoover was relying on people to act out of their own goodwill in many cases. He wasn't forcing them to do things. And in some cases, some of his ideas, well, you can see his reasoning behind it, but actually maybe didn't help things. And you've got to go through and assess this and think about Hoover yourself and what role he played in the Depression. I would argue that you can't blame Hoover for the Great Depression. It's too much to blame one person for such a catastrophic event. It's more plausible to blame the Republican governments of the 1920s, of which Hoover was a part. But by the time Hoover took office and the things that he was responsible for, well, you can't really say he was to blame for the Great Depression. But what you can say is that he didn't do a right lot to help when the Great Depression kicked in. And that would be the main criticism of Hoover. He stuck too rigidly to rugged individualism. He stuck too rigidly to laissez-faire. And he didn't step in quickly enough. And he didn't step in hard enough to try to help the American people. And this is why I believe he lost the election of 1932 by such a landslide. But you've got to also be aware that there's counter-arguments to all this. Initially, he was massively criticised by historians for doing very little to help. Later on, people started to realise, well, he did do some things to help, but he was a victim of his own beliefs, because the things that he was trying to do didn't actually work. And later on in the 1980s, his achievements were reassessed again, and thought about a little bit differently, and said, well, maybe in other circumstances what Hoover was trying to do might have worked. There's even one historian who suggests that Hoover tried to do too much, and if he'd not done so much, maybe things would have recovered themselves a little bit quicker. Anyway, that's all bits and pieces. So I hope, if you were learning from this, that you paused and made notes at the appropriate points, and if you were revising, you used the 2 colour methods that I mentioned at the start, and will have told you in lesson at some point as well before the exam time. And there we go, that's all from me on the Great Depression and impacts, as well as what Hoover's role in all of it was.